we're excited. We're excited about this upcoming series. It won't be this next week, but it'll be the next week. And we'll be kicking off our Christmas series, which we are calling How the Grinch Can Steal Your Christmas. You're not going to want to miss that. We'll do that for 4 weeks in the month of December, and we're looking forward to that. Just kind of let you know what I'll be doing next week. I try to do this once a year, and what I'll be doing next week is I'm actually going to be teaching on the other side of the building. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll teach the kids, and I will also teach the teenagers next, because I just think that's kind of fun. And the few reasons why we do this, okay, one is that I think it's really important that I am not just the pastor of like this room, but it's also important for me to be the pastor of the building. And so it's a great opportunity for me to go and like hang out with kids and hanging out with students. And last year, actually, it resulted in the kids getting a new sound system. So it worked out really good for me being down there. So, so I'll be down there. And I'm also really just excited to get to speak to the teenagers. It's been about 2.5 years since I've done that regularly. And I'm very much looking forward to having to earn everything for about 30 minutes. So that's going to be really, really fun. I enjoy that, but it'll be fun. So Pastor Nathan will be in here speaking, and he will close out the series, write this down. But I would just say this, that if you've got kids or students, I'm looking forward to hanging out with them. If there's a way you can be here, I really look forward to getting to do that. It's a great thing. I don't want to call it a tradition yet because I'm really leery of that word this time of year. Like I've got tradition, like whatever, because people say it and then they don't follow through, but they just like the idea of maybe doing it all the time. So we'll hold off for maybe a couple more years and then we'll do it. But I'm pumped about that. Looking forward to it. We're finishing up our series on 1 Peter that we are finishing up the next 2 weeks. And as we wind down this book, we enter into the last chapter, chapter 5. And what Peter is doing is he's shifting his focus not just to those in the church, but he also speaks, I would say prophetically, through them to us to help us see, okay, what is it going to take for the church to survive until Jesus returns? And he specifically shifts his focus to talk to leaders in the church. Because I know John Maxwell says this, he says that everything rises and falls on leadership. And so certainly in the church, it is very true that leadership is important. And so he starts talking about that. And before we dive into what he said, I've been thinking about like my experience leading in the church. And I've been in some form of like volunteer or pastoral leadership since I was 18 years old. So it's about 15 years of leadership in one way or another. And here's what I can tell you, okay? That when you lead, there are moments in the church where you lead and you're like, man, that was cool. And then there are moments where you lead and you're like, did that just happen? Like you have a little bit of both, okay? So this happened. Joanne and I were talking about this after the worship night, and this is the church we were at in Lake of the Ozarks. And they would do this thing where people would come forward for prayer. And they would do it during the first part of the service. And so people are coming forward for prayer, and Joanne and I are up there. And this lady comes up to us, and she's got this look on her face, and I'm like, how can we pray for you? And before I even get there, she says, yeah, I kind of just feel like I need to run around the room. Is that okay? And I like right as I'm getting ready to say, like, how do I answer this? Like, what is going on? Like, and the church is a little bit more like charismatic Pentecostal than this one. And I was like, well, and she said, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and do it anyways. God told me to. And she just started running, okay? Like just running around the room. And it wasn't that she was just running as if that weren't enough, but she had like this, like she was kind of like flocking like a chicken like that. And so she was running, flapping her arms, and then every 5 seconds, she would let out what I will refer to as a rebel yell. And I'm like, and everybody in the room is like, what is happening? And my lead pastor looks over at me and kind of gives me that scowling look, like, what did you tell her to make her do that? And I look at him and I'm like, I don't know, man, I'm sorry. It happened, and in the moment, so then that really happened. Like I was a pastor, and then whatever. You go back to your seat after moments like that, and you think, "What in the world?" Like, and then you go home and you're like, man, like, I didn't even have a chance to say any, like, that's what people are going to remember. And I couldn't even stop. Like, you feel kind of stupid. And then there are moments, though, in the church when you're in leadership and you get to experience things. And this is true of this seat, and this would be true of any seat, where you're just like, man, I got to be part of that. And it's really amazing. It's humbling to be there. I was thinking as I just was reflecting on my time here, and there are people who are at our service at 9:30 who I remember going in the hospital to pray with them. And I got called in on my day off because they said, I think that she's going to pass soon. And I remember walking in the room and everything, it just feels so heavy. And just you get to pray with these people. And the crazy thing is that God, like, she was here at 9:30, like, and this was a couple of years ago. Like, you walk out of those situations and you're just like, wow, like, I got to be there. There are moments where I've had the privilege of praying with people right before they enter into the presence of God. And there's this humbling thing that happens, but here's what's important as you think of yourself as a leader in the church, is that we have to realize that there are both moments where you're going to be like, wow, I was part of that. But then there also are going to be moments that are frustrating and challenging, and you wonder why that even happened. Why is she screaming? Like that's part of it. But here's what we see as we look at 1 Peter. That no matter the moment, how we lead doesn't change. That no matter what the moment, no matter what people do, no matter our response is the same. And now as before I get to 1 Peter, I know some of you are thinking, why am I here? I'm not a leader. I don't lead anything. Like I wish I would have known this so I could have got a head start on Thanksgiving or whatever. And so you're like, what am I doing here? And I would just say to you this, that if we look at the pattern of the early church, that the pattern of the early church was that leaders are supposed to lead in a way that those who weren't leaders could follow. So even if you're not a leader, the principles are true because you're supposed to be following the example of your leader. And I'll just read this to you. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1. This is Paul speaking. He says, follow me. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So if you are here in this room and you follow Jesus, whether you're a leader or whether you're a follower, we are all following Jesus. And if you don't see yourself as a leader in the church, here's what you're doing. You're following a leader as they follow Jesus. So for you look at these messages, and here's what you have to ask yourself. As you think about the church that you're part of, do they set an example worth following? Are they someone who you can emulate? Because Paul says you are to follow your leaders as they follow Christ. And I would just say to you that this isn't just pastoral leadership. That you might be here and you lead kids. These principles certainly are important for you. You might be in a connect group with people. You might lead a connect group. There might be students who look up to you. You might serve in the cafe alongside you. It really doesn't matter what you do. As you lead in the church, this is how you lead in the church. And so we're just going to walk through 1 Peter chapter 5. We're going to go through it verse by verse, and we'll start in chapter 5, verse 1. Peter speaking, he says, So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Now that's a verse that honestly you kind of like, if you're like reading your Bible, like you're probably going to skip over it. Doesn't really seem like much. You're like, okay. But as you zoom in, you see that Peter's doing something actually really stunning. First, you got that word so. And what he's doing there with that word so is he's connecting what he is saying to what he just said. And so what did he just say? He said that in the church, you will suffer. And when you suffer, it is your responsibility to trust God. And so he's connecting leadership to suffering. When people are suffering, what do they need? They need leadership. They need to know how to get through it, and as a leader, that is going to be your responsibility to help people as they endure things and try to trust God as they endure them. But then you have Peter, okay? And he says this thing. He refers to himself here as a fellow elder. Now, I find that very interesting because this is Peter talking. And if you have a church background, he's that Peter. He like Jesus had 12 disciples. Inside of that 12, there were 3 that were closer. Peter was one of the 3. That most people believe that Peter was the leader of the first century church. That he had this title that would be apostle. And we don't see a lot of apostles anymore, do we? And when someone tells you they are, you're like, yeah, okay. So but he really was one. That he's got real authority. His name carries weight. And yet here he is addressing these leaders. And he addresses them as one of them. He says, as a fellow elder. Instead of elevating himself over people so that they submit to him, he says, no, I am going to put myself at your level so that you can follow my example. You probably all met that person, right, who got the promotion. And once they got the promotion, things just seemed beneath them. Like Peter is not that guy. But rather, he is this guy who is saying, no, I'm with you. And even thinking about like the sufferings that were mentioned in the previous chapter, he's saying, I'm a fellow elder. I am not beyond or above the sufferings that will come as a result of your relationship with Jesus. He's like, I'm one of you. And then he draws our attention to something that I find very just weird when you think about people in leadership. Because what do people in leadership do? Like, they put on this good face, right? They don't want you to see their blemishes. And if they make a really big mistake, they work very hard to hide that big mistake. And Peter here, he refers to himself as someone who was a witness of the sufferings of Christ. A witness of the sufferings of Christ. Now, when Jesus suffered the most, Peter was nowhere to be found. There was a situation where Jesus is having a meal with his disciples right before he is crucified. And Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, I tell you the truth. One of you is going to betray me. And Peter hops up and says, not me, Lord. And Jesus says to Peter, Peter, I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Anybody in the first century reading that letter would have been aware that that's what Peter did. And when they think of Peter and the sufferings of Christ, they think of a guy who wasn't there when Jesus needed him the most. And yet here you have Peter, this leader, drawing attention to one of his biggest foibles ever. That he witnessed the sufferings of Christ, kind of. He didn't really acknowledge him when it happened. And this is Peter, as he's finishing his letter, really like wanting to leave his mark, making sure that you see that it's not about Peter, that it's really all about Jesus. And to not become so enamored with the person of Peter, but to realize the grace of Jesus. That's what you see. Because even though he denied knowing Jesus 3 times, when Jesus needed him the most as he's getting ready to be crucified, Peter says that he's also a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. The guy who denied him when he needed him the most is also going to be someone who will partake in the glory of Christ. that I bet there are some of you here, and you look at your past, you think about your life, and you think, man, I have done some stuff. You feel a lot of shame. You feel a lot of guilt. You think, gosh, there's no way that God would love me, that he would accept me, that he would want me. I bet none of you denied Jesus 3 times on the night he needed you the most. I bet none of you disowned Jesus like Peter did there. And if Peter, if he gets the glory, then that means that even in all of our mistakes, there's hope too. And so Peter's setting this example of a humble leader. He's showing them how to lead through his example. And then he looks forward and he speaks directly to these elders. Look at this here. Verse 2. He says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly as God would have you. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Not domineering those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. So as he shifts to these leaders in the church, he wants them to see a few things. First off, he wants them to see that the people that are brought to them, they don't own. They don't own them. Whose sheep are they? They're God's sheep. And so even as you think of your responsibilities here, the things that you do, the people that you interact with, maybe the people that you have the privilege of leading, they're not yours. They're only there because God brought them there. Which in some ways is nice, right? Because if God's the one that brought them there, like he's gonna take responsibility for that. But even though that might be like true, like that's going to carry some weight too. Because God brought them to you so that you could lead them and love them. It really works both ways. I remember I was having a meeting with a mentor of mine, and he just recent, like for him, it was a couple years ago, he just had a large group of people leave his church to start another one. And I did that thing where you're compassionate and you lower your voice to show your compassion, you know what I'm talking about? I was like, oh man, I heard about, that's so bad, I'm so sorry. And he starts laughing at me, which I thought was weird. And he's like, Ryan, here's what you got to realize. You don't own anybody. Everybody, it's all God's. And if you know who I'm talking about, you could maybe that impression. But still, he's like, you don't. He's like, people are going to come and go. But here's your responsibility, is that when they are there, it's your responsibility to love and to serve them, and you should carry a level of weight because God brought them to your care. And here's what I can assure you. I can assure you that is a weight that I carry. That is a responsibility that I feel for anybody who would call this place home. But here's my challenge to you. I shouldn't be the only one that carries the weight. You should carry it too. And that if we really want to actually do something that matters, then it's going to require all of us saying, the people that are here, God's brought. We've got to treat them like God brought them here and love them like God brought them here. And if we all carry that weight in all the things that we do, could you imagine the difference we would make? If people came in here and they really felt loved and cared for and appreciated and valued? That this is what Peter's talking about, and he's saying, this is how the church should function. This is how you should shepherd people. This is how you lead a church. And then he dives in to some abuses. And what I find so funny is he wrote this 2,000 years ago. And these are still things that are inside of all of our hearts. Isn't it amazing that over the course of 2,000 years, we really haven't changed that much? I mean, look at this. He says, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you. This is Peter's way of saying, serve the kingdom. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Don't do it under compulsion. Then that's not to say that you're going to enjoy everything you do. Some of you nursery workers, on those days when that nursery's full, like, you got to stir up the joy. I know. But there should be a sense as you serve his church that is, yeah, I'm doing what God wants me to do. Yeah, this is hard. I probably wouldn't, like, I don't know if I'd want every day to be like this, but you know what? I'm building the kingdom through what I'm doing. Because if your reason for serving is, well, if I don't do this, no one else will, then that's not the reason to serve. And if that's really what you think, how small do you think this place is? Not only how small do you think God is that he needs you in that role? So what Peter's saying is he's saying, as you lead, do so willingly, not under compulsion. And this is God's will. That it is God's will that you would serve him in that way. That he loves joyful service. That he loves it when people are doing things to advance his mission with a smile on their face. And then he goes on and he says this verse that I find is very interesting. He says, not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Okay, he wrote that 2,000 years ago. The church was way different 2,000 years ago than it was today. When I see the line about shameful gain, I actually think about when I was in Bible college. We're sitting around a circle talking about our dreams and goals for ministry. And we came across this guy. We called him Real Life Ricky. I don't know, it doesn't matter. It's not his real name. And we're like, what do you want to do? What do you want to? And he was like, you know what I really want to do? I want to be on TBN someday. That's why I'm doing this. I'm doing this so I can be on TBN. If you don't know what that is, it's a Christian TV station. And if you're wondering, is it that Christian TV station? Yeah, it's that Christian TV station. It's like you kind of feel like, dude, missed the point a little bit maybe, right? Like we have lanes here in the church where you can actually become a pastor and like have a level of fame and notoriety, and your voice will carry a certain level of weight. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's like what you're going after, I think that's kind of what Peter's saying, don't go after. Which, look, this is why I think it's interesting. He wrote that 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, there weren't mega churches. There were churches of about 100 people, and they met underground, and no one talked about it. And there were, like, Christian celebrities, and they were famous, so they died for being a Christian. And so the idea of, like, climbing this ladder, like, it wasn't there. So it means one of two things. One, Peter might be speaking prophetically to us, which is very possible. Or that even in the small underground church setting, people are figuring out ways to make shameful gains for themselves. And this questions the heart of why you do what you do. Then maybe some of you here, you work in like a not-for-profit, and you got to ask, why do I do this? Maybe it's got a gospel mission. Maybe you work on staff at a church, like, or I don't know. If you work on staff at a church, it's weird. Like they're not even in here, so they don't qualify. But maybe you do things. As you do the things that you do to serve the church, you've got to ask yourself why. Is it just for a paycheck? Because if it is, that you're missing it. That if it's just for like being seen as a leader, like that seems kind of shameful. That if it's just for like wanting to prove someone wrong, like that would be a wrong reason for doing it. Then what Peter's saying is like, don't like do things willingly. Do things for the gospel. Do things because you're called. Move beyond those other reasons. And then he gives another example, and he says this. He says, not domineering those over your charge, but being examples to the flock. We've all probably worked for that guy, right? Who's maybe a little domineering. And what Peter's saying, he's saying that has no place in the church. that style of leadership isn't what I expect out of my leaders. That instead of dominating people to a point of submission where they just do what you say, really what you need to do is you need to lead in a way where people will follow your example. Don't lead by domination, lead by example. And here's the thing, as you lead, your example grows. I like the way that Dan Doriani said it in his commentary on 1 Peter. He says, every privilege gained is a freedom lost. That as you lead, there are just things you don't do anymore. And maybe I'd illustrate it this way. You've probably experienced this in your house. You ever watch a movie with your kids that you liked when you were a kid? You're watching it, and then that scene comes that you forgot was in there. And you look over at your spouse, and you're like, and you don't have to say anything in that moment. Because in that moment, you're both thinking the same thing. It's, do we power through or do we turn it off? And why do you have that moment with your spouse where you're like, I didn't know this was in the Goonies. Why do you... why is that happening? It's because you're afraid of the example that you're setting your kids. You don't want them to get the wrong idea because of your example, so in that moment you have to decide, do we leave it on or do we turn it off? It works the same way in leadership. That as people look to you, they're looking to you. They're looking at the example that you follow. Are you setting an example that people can follow? Because people will grab onto things they can't. So Peter says it. So he addresses the leaders. He talks to them, and then he shifts, and he talks to those who are followers. And Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. So we're all followers. But he speaks specifically to those who follow in the church, and this is what he says here in verse 5. He says, likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility towards one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Now, it's an interesting verse. Peter is king of weird fragments. That's kind of what he's been doing for a while to me. And he's got that line, you are younger, be subject to the elders. So the first question is, what does he mean by elder there? And so I can tell you, everything that I read said that he's talking about positional authority of elder in the church. Which makes a lot of sense because he just finished talking to elders. He used the same word there. It would seem weird if that became an age thing. He would probably have used a different word in the Greek. But then the question then is, though, what does he mean by younger? What is he saying to the younger? So there's really two schools of thought. One is that when he says younger, he's talking in terms of those who are younger in the church compared to the elders. That they haven't been in the church as long, and so they are younger, which kind of makes sense because there's nothing, he doesn't say anything to those who are middle-aged. It's just younger elder. So that is certainly a way to look at it, but honestly the more common view is that he's talking to people who are actually younger in terms of age. Because by and large, the younger you are, the more headstrong you are. And I can tell you this, I know that from example, I never knew more than I did when I was 18 years old. And that was about everything, actually. So I can see that, but here's the thing, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't, because the response is the same. Clothe yourselves, all of you. That's all of you. That's everybody. Older, younger, elder, younger, middle-aged. It doesn't really matter that in your interactions of the church, everyone needs to clothe themselves with humility. The most important thing as we interact as a body is that we're people who are humble, and we're humble towards other people. And you could define humility a lot of different ways. I would say in this context that the way I would define it would be someone who considers other people's needs and wants higher than their own. But there also would be an element of humility that is a willingness to do things that you might consider beneath you. That a humble person is not going to look at a job and say, no, I won't do that. But Peter's saying inside of the church, you need to interact with one another humbly. I'll tell you this, there's one thing I know about God. He does not like pride. And pride would be the opposite of any of those things. He does not like it. I mean, look at the strong language that he uses here talking about those who are proud. It says, God opposes the proud. I would guess that when you woke up this morning, you didn't say, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to take on God, especially if you believe in him. But every time you exercise pride, God says he will take you on. God says, I oppose the proud. So you want to feel like you're running against a brick wall? Be proud. And I would guess that the reason why our pride bothers him so much is that all the things that give us pride ultimately come from him, don't they? He gave you everything. To be proud about it seems kind of weird, right? Because it's all from him. And so you see this interaction. So you see what's expected of leadership. You see humble response, humble leaders. And then you see him talk to all of us and how we approach God. And he wants us to approach him humbly. Look at this in verse 6. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all of your anxieties on him because he cares for you. He says, humble yourself. Humble yourself and approach God. Notice the action is on you to humble yourself. I would guess it's because if you don't, something else probably will. But if you humble yourself, if you bring yourself low, God will lift you up. And for some of you, the idea of like humbling yourself and praying seems weird. Maybe you're one of those people and you're like a self-made guy, self-made lady. The idea of just saying, I'm going to take some time and pray about this when you could be working seems strange. And what Peter's saying, he's saying that's exactly what you need to do. That you need to humble yourself and talk to God. And if you do that, he will lift you up. I mean, that's a promise. But so often what we do is we come up with all the reasons why we don't need to humble ourselves. And then we never get lifted up, and it's because we're full of pride, and we're afraid to look to the one who can help us. And then Peter says, verse 7, and I'll tell you this, verse 7 is a warm blanket to my soul. It's one of my favorite verses of all time, and it's that we cast all of our anxieties on him because he cares for us. And here's why this verse has always been beautiful to me. It's because that word all. That's all. That we can, if it matters to you, it matters to him. Like, this is stupid, but I had a dentist appointment on Tuesday. Okay? I hate going to the dentist. My least favorite thing in the whole wide world. If you're a dentist, I'm really sorry, but I don't want to see you. Like, here's the thing. I don't like it. All right? And here's why. I didn't want to spend December in the dentist office getting cavities filled. And here's what I can tell you. More times than I would want to admit, I prayed to God that I wouldn't have cavities. And I kept going back. And you know what I quoted? I quoted that verse. God, you said to cast all your anxiety on you, and I don't want a cavity, so if you would not do that. And here's what I can tell you. That as I prayed that to God, he was not ambivalent towards that request. He didn't look at heaven and be like, what an idiot. There are 7 billion people in the world, and he's talking to me about his mouth. Because that's not what he does. It says, cast all of your anxiety on him. And you know that he doesn't respond that way because it says he cares for you. So it doesn't matter what it is in your life that's causing you worry. He cares. It really might be as stupid as a cavity, but here's what I can tell you, that God cares. He wants you to talk to him, but so often we don't because of our pride. And I really believe there are people in this room who God wants to do great things in your life, but for whatever reason, you're afraid to talk to him about it, and the reason why you're afraid is because of your pride. And he's in heaven just thinking, gosh, I wish you would just talk to me about that. Gosh, I care. I told you I care. I said all. What more can I do? But you're like, nah, I got it. And if you would just humble yourself, he would lift you up. So as I close this morning, the survival of the church, the word is humility. That in order for the church to project out into the next 30 years, what we need to be humble. That we need humble leaders who set an example worth following. That we also need humble followers who are willing to follow the example that's set by those who are in leadership. That willingly say, okay, I realize that God has put that person in that position. I'm gonna honor that person because God's put them there. But then if we're also going to survive, if we're going to make it, it's going to require us to pray. It's going to require us to realize and to humble ourselves in such a way that we realize that all of the things in our heart God cares about. To realize that there's this confidence that he gives us, that if it matters to us, then it also matters to him. And that's where I want to land this morning, is I want you to think about your life. I want you to think about like what's in your mind, the things that cause you worry, the things that cause you joy. And here's what I want you, like, what is that thing that you just haven't asked about? What is that prayer that's in your life that you maybe think he doesn't care about? You just haven't had the courage to ask. Or maybe it's not that it's too small, but you think it's too big. All means all. And so you think, yeah, I just don't know. I'm afraid to ask. And I would just say that God brought you here this morning to hear that. He brought you here this morning that you would hear that you can cast all of the things that make you anxious, all of the things that make you worried, that you can give that all to him. And as big or as small as that might be, that doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because he cares about you. So what is that thing you're afraid to talk to him about?
Thank you for watching our services. If you have questions or you would like more information, you can visit us online at nlspringfield.com. We'd also love to have you join us at one of our Sunday morning services. We have programs at 9:30 and 11 for adults, students, and kids. We hope to see you there.